we're right on time, so I'm gonna go ahead and start it off. Thank you everyone for coming on into the webinar. Really excited that you wanted to learn about storytelling using SciArt, mostly from a lot we picked up from kind of our work at Lifeology, which we'll get into in a minute. But thought we'd share. So I'll go ahead and start with a couple of intros. So my name is Doryan Algarra. I'm VP of Design at Lifeology. I'm also co-founder of Lifeology, which we'll get into in a minute. I mostly do a lot of the product design for the products that we have, as well as illustration and product design as well, and creative direction for Lifeology. That's kind of been my role, and I've been with the company for about 4 years and just really loving it and really excited to be able to share some of this information, some of the stuff that we've learned with all of you. Go ahead, Laurel, my co-host.
Hi, I'm Laurel Shelley-Reuss. I am the content illustrator here at Lifeology. I'm relatively new, but before I started here, I was a freelance illustrator and comic book artist. I've been a comic book artist for about 15 years now. I've worked for government agencies, libraries, companies, all sorts of nonprofits. So I have a lot of experience doing both comics and illustration for a variety of clients.
Great. Awesome. So we're gonna go ahead on and jump in. Hopefully you all on Zoom can see us or see our faces as well as the presentation. And please feel free to put any questions in the chat while we're going through this, as towards the end, we'll have time for questions that we'll want to answer them, as many as we can. So I'll go ahead and start with the story of Lifeology. The context is, this definitely is in line with what we're talking about here, because the story of Lifeology is the story of kind of storytelling with SciArt. So Lifeology is a platform and communication tool that we use to engage broader audiences in science and health and research. And we do this by way of a fun and accessible way. We do this with these beautifully illustrated science-backed bite-sized flashcard courses. It's all delivered on mobile devices, and it's something that we incubated here at Lifeology that I co-founded along with Pedro. And what we did is it was a hackathon project, and the idea initially came from what I found to be a lack of truly user-friendly science information. I knew that personally, I always learned better when I could tie it to a story or a metaphor that I could relate to. This was essentially the seed of Lifeology. We did a lot of reading in the company around science and those kind of things. And, a lot of those concepts are really hard to grasp, but I realized that when metaphor was brought into it, along with some art, although I didn't find that a lot either, but when at least there was a metaphor, a story, it all was a better experience, both for me retaining the information and also for understanding what was going on. I also enjoyed it. So what we did is we took that level of rebuilding the story, bringing it into this platform. And then the other cool thing was we said, let's bring in art. And I know in the world of science, SciArt has, if depending on who you ask, SciArt could be a very specific thing. So it could be biological art, so art that is very true to life, like you ever seen the textbooks and they have all the cells and the skeletal body and all this type of thing. Those are very detailed artwork, and those are artists that do those type of things. This is not that at all. This is the other side of it. This is using creative, visual, stylistic ways of displaying this information. And we did that on purpose, because again, if we're bringing science and health and art to a broader audience, to a lay audience, and it isn't a researcher or clinician speaking to another researcher, it's trying to speak to the masses, then we should rewrite it in a way where it's more accessible. And same thing, the artwork just keeps you compelled. It'll tell the story, and you'll want to continue the story. So that's kind of the beginning of that. And as you can see from the slide that I'm showing, this is an example of, this is what it actually looks like on the phone. So you'll be able to see these card, this card pattern. It's a flashcard. It's nothing, we didn't invent anything new there, but we did it in a way where we're serving it up. And anyone with internet connection can access these in this format. But when you do the work, the method that we come to, which is bring a story into it, which we'll get into in more detail in a second, that's when this really comes to life, when you pair the artwork with a story rewritten in a broader sense with a story arc. Then you really have something, you really have a way of showing and describing this information in a way that people just retain and they'll enjoy it. And it's something that we are very passionate about here at Lifeology. So using, let me get into this. So I'm going to let Laurel get into the kind of the key pieces of kind of how we bring in story into this world and along with the art. So I'll let Laurel go.
Okay, so when we're creating a course, we set up kind of, the first thing we talk about is we do a narrative. Like, how can we tell a story around the concept that we're talking about? How can we make this approachable and memorable for people? So, for example, we're talking right now about doing some neurology courses, and our first concept is, well, let's talk about doing a neuron as a character. You know, here's where they live in your body. They get their little briefcase, they get up, they go to work, they meet their other little neuron coworkers, they go into their office, wherever that is, and we kind of follow them on a journey. And this is what makes it a little easier for people to understand and relate to. These are concepts that everyone has in their lives. And this is really common when we talk about trying to essentially condense content for people. It's easier when you give them a narrative. It's easier when you give them something that they can relate to. You see this a lot in younger education as well. When I worked in libraries, we talked a lot about reluctant readers with children. And when you look at children who are very, they're struggling to get into chapter books, they're struggling to really like reading. The thing that most librarians recommend you do is you give them comic books, because comic books are more approachable. There are pictures that they can follow, there are stories, there are narratives, and you can have comics on any topic. It doesn't have to be superheroes. You can have comics on historians, you can have comics on science, you can do all of these things. And this is what gets at least some kids really engaged in reading that wouldn't otherwise, get there. And I think we can move this concept into the adult world as well. Obviously, we're talking about a little more complex concepts than what we'd give to kids, but I think the methodology really remains the same.
Yeah, that's great. And I will say too, it's much more difficult to write content in this way, especially in the Lifeology format. And we're talking in general too, but in the Lifeology format, where we're taking these bite-sized pieces, we're talking about very kind of complex ideas, but just the exercises rewriting it in a way where it's bite-sized, one, just in length, but also in wrapping it around a story arc. That is, it's not trivial. It takes some kind of rethinking, but in the end, what you'll have is a much more accessible, vehicle for learning this information. And once we have that, so in what Laurel was saying, like once we have all that, once you have the story and it's rewritten in these pieces, we then have what we can give to the artist to go ahead and write a visual representation of that. And there's nothing better for an artist than to have a story. If you have a story, that means you have characters. That means you have a setting. That means you have, scenarios. You have a world that you could play in. That is truly what is kind of like the beauty of bringing all those pieces together. So when the artist comes in and they say, "Oh wow, this is a great arc," and now we've defined characters, then we can start getting into really interesting things like making sure we're bringing in diversity. So who's the character? Where are they located? What type of demographics are we going? And this goes into a bunch of things like who are we talking to? Who are we trying to reach? But it really opens up a lot. And this is what we mean, really. It's really the core of what we're talking about with the storytelling and the art. Meaning, if you have a concept, if you have an idea that you're writing, whether it's science, health, or whatever it is, taking that extra step to wrap it around a story with characters, hopefully, and then working with an artist to make that story come to life. That's what we found works. And we're tackling something, like I said earlier, when we were thinking of bringing Lifeology to life, we're still there, but we're at a point where we were starting to see the shift in the general public kind of not trusting science, with the pandemic and COVID and everything going on, all those discussions. There's this big arc of science not really being really taken as seriously as it used to, and so it was a prime time for us to bring these concepts, because I think part of the reason why that is, and this is just my theory, is when you don't understand something, it's a lot easier to just like not really believe in it. So, and this is me personally, even as I was growing up, that's how I felt about it. So I think illuminating some of these concepts in this way, where it's much more accessible and I understand it, hopefully will broaden it, and then we can start having a dialogue and people start learning and embracing science and health, and as opposed to like not even giving it a chance. So it's even a larger kind of concept than that. So yeah, so what we're going to get into now is science and art and storytelling. So I wanted to bring up something that we recently did in August of this year. I was part of a research article that also my other co-founder and some other team members from Lifeology and other researchers were part of, and it was called Visual Narratives About COVID-19, Improve Message Accessibility, Self-Efficacy, and Health Precautions. That was the name of the article. I'll make sure to post it in the chat as well, the link to it. And although this article is in the context of COVID-19, the main focus was around using, the main focus was us using visual narratives as tools for science and health communication, especially to broad audiences. So it was it's exactly what we're talking about here. And we mentioned that during the pandemic, there was a lot of educational resources that sprung from it. Everyone was talking about COVID-19 and the pandemic and all these things. However, the communication efforts still left large segments of the population out, especially those with low health literacy skills. And that wasn't really, because during the pandemic, they're worrying more about like, all right, let's get this information out there. Not so much how it goes out there. So, according to the CDC, health information has historically been presented such that it's not accessible to most Americans and also globally. So it is a problem. Following this path, we understood that health and science related education, should use plain language, narrative, and visuals or multimedia to improve that accessibility. So during the course of our research and in the research of the product itself, we found that people typically enjoy content that is visual, illustrations or sequential art, as Laurel was saying, comics and those types of things, more than non-visual content. So visuals they'll aid learning among those with different learning styles and preferences. They'll improve the motivation to learn, increase the engagement with the topics. So you're more apt to seek out and get more interested in these things. Improve information processing and retention. Like I said, even the way I used to study a long time ago when I was in school, it was I would kind of pair something with an idea or a story, and that alone would be a mechanism for me to do better in a test or retain information. Visuals can also stimulate critical thinking, and essentially it can help people take in information faster, more accurately, and remember it better. I mean, that's essentially what the storytelling along with the artwork will do for not only specifically science and health, but just in general. So that was a lot of talking. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next piece, which is collaboration. So we do this by collaborating with many different communities and people. And one of the things we did at Lifeology, we understood that for this to be at all successful, we would need a community. And that means we would need artists and we would need writers who would want to help us on this journey. And that means collaboration. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to Laurel, and she could tell the group about different ways that you could find groups and communities online to help collaborate. And this is specifically what we've heard from researchers in health and writers about where do I find artists, where can I find them? Hopefully Lifeology will be one of those places now, but there are other communities. So I'll let her speak to that quickly.
Yeah, so in addition to the Lifeology community that we have already, there are a number of different places you can go to find artists online. They tend to be kind of specialized depending on where you go. So if you go somewhere like DeviantArt, you tend to get more cartoony versus somewhere like Dribble, where you get very focused like designers. Dribble is a big graphic design hub, and any illustrators you find there will be more on the design spectrum than, say, the comic book spectrum that you might find on DeviantArt. Behance is also a good art community to look at. If you go to Instagram or Twitter, you both probably want to look at hashtags on those to specifically look for artists rather than searching for like a keyword. So if you want to like look at Instagram and say, I'm just going to look at the SciArt hashtag and see what's out there, there are a number of really great artists there that you can just kind of find. And then when you're contacting an individual artist, you obviously want to go, through their particular commission channels. Some of them, have specifics that you'll need to address. And obviously, when you're working with a freelance artist, they might have a schedule that you'll have to adhere to. So if you have a timeline that you're looking at for building your course, you obviously want to think about who's available in addition to, who you like. But part of, finding someone who works with you is you need to have a vision a little bit and say, okay, if I'm reaching out for a particular audience, maybe I want to find an artist from that audience so who will speak to them, or at least, will be able to kind of consult a little bit and make sure that what I'm doing is appropriate for that particular group. And that's really important when you think about these courses, is if you're going to try and engage a demographic, you really want to make sure that it's really earnest and that you're doing it in an authentic way with people who are from that demographic. And you want to make sure that, you're not really reaching beyond your scope as it was.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also I'll throw in there that's super important. And even when we're talking about this storytelling, again, why it's so important, having that story arc, having that narrative is going to be critical to the artist, to having that conversation with an artist. It's hard enough for a researcher or a clinician or whoever you are to try to tap an artist and say, hey, I need work on my, I did a research paper. Can you illustrate it? And if it's just starting from scratch there, it's going to be pretty daunting for an artist to, take that information. So doing these steps, as we're saying, bringing in the storytelling, taking that extra step of saying, okay, well, I'm going to bring in the story or a character or a scenario or some type of theme, that will be kind of what the artist will latch onto. I used a metaphor like rock climbing, if anyone's ever been rock climbing. So the whole thing of rock climbing is getting to the next crevice or crack that you can grab to get to the next step so you can move on. So if you're thinking of like a narrative or a story, every piece, for us it's Lifeology cards, but for every piece you need that connecting point. If an artist goes to grab and there's nothing to hold on to, it's going to be difficult. You're going to find there's going to be a gap, and you could work around that, but it's much better if there is something to hold on to. And that's where the storytelling piece is. I find it as the connection points between the entire story, and that's where the artist can really come in and latch on and really grab on tight. And that way, when the reader reads this, everything's all drawn together, everything flows together. Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's Laurel, go if you want to speak on some of the communication tips and things that we use here.
Sure. So the first thing I do when I'm, taking on a new project is I start talking about the basics. And the first thing I talk about, which I mentioned briefly before, is like, who's the audience? Like, who are we trying to reach with this? And because that really informs like what kind of characters I design for it, like who I'm going to draw. But the other big thing that I like to talk about is like, do you want to create a feeling about this? Like what's the end result that you want people to get out of this? If they're going to be happier and healthier, do we show someone getting healthier over the course of the story that we're telling? What is the end result that you want out of this sort of thing? And I think, if you talk about that, then when you say, okay, I want this to be, really positive, I want it to be upbeat, I choose certain colors depending on, that kind of feedback. I choose certain drawing styles. And a lot of this, it seems kind of simple, but you have to really think about it. If you don't really have anything in mind when you're going into hiring an artist, it's easy to be more flexible. But if you do have something in mind, say you go in and you're like, I want something that looks pretty much like this example I have here, and then you contact an artist who doesn't do work like that example, you're not going to have the best time communicating with them. You want to find somebody who really matches what your vision is, if you have a vision. If you don't, then you need to spend some time communicating with your artist about what you can do together, which is also fine. There's no reason to really have an idea of what the image needs to look like in your head, but you need to be willing to kind of think about, other related pieces to that. We brainstorm metaphors a lot for this. So we talk about like, okay, if we're going to talk about cardiology, we're going to talk about how the heart works. We're going to talk about, your pulmonary system. Then, for example, we just did this the other week and we ended up using pipes in a house as our example for that. So we're not drawing, medically accurate illustrations most of the time. We're drawing, really accessible, small, cute things that people can engage with and really understand the idea of it, even if they're not going to be able to go and take a medical exam exactly right after. After we do that, we end up storyboarding it. So after we have kind of the narrative written out and kind of any suggestions on visuals, then as the artist, I come in and I do a bunch of sketches. And from those sketches, we start to revise. We talk about what works, what doesn't, if something needs to be adjusted. In some cases for medical accuracy, we adjust there. And we make sure that before we start kind of our final version of these illustrations, all our ducks in a row, everybody's happy with it. And, part of that is just keeping the communication lines open and being, happy to talk between your artist and your writer about what's working and what isn't. And, every artist I know is very used to having critical feedback. You're not going to hurt feelings if you say, hey, I think we need to change this. It's just being open to change in either way, because sometimes your artist may come in and have an idea that you didn't think of, and you can go with that. It's okay to make, small changes at the storyboarding stage.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute. Yes, that's perfect. And I do want to stress again, getting as much of that information up front as possible, whether when like when trying to team up with an artist or someone on this type of storytelling. The more detailed, the better. Even though even if you didn't have an idea, so like some of these creative briefs and templates, I mean, it doesn't have to get really super complicated. It could be as a matter as simple as just saying, who's the audience? Who are you trying to, really deliver this to? What is the tone? We use that word a lot. Like, what is the tone? So, for example, a while back we did a Lifeology course on breast cancer, and obviously the tone is important here because we mentioned it's a very serious subject, so that needs to be taken into account. We don't want to do a super cartoony style, so that like lets us know what kind of style we want to go to. We also don't want it to be super, kind of dry or anything like that. So though, just having those questions and jotting them down and then bringing those to the artist is going to be tremendously helpful, because they'll be more than happy to kind of draw the rest out. You just want to start there. And again, stressing again, the story, having a story, even if it's not fully fleshed out, or it's like, well, I have an idea of a character, or I have a metaphor, or something that will be helpful bringing into this conversation. Because then that's when the artist, because that's what artists do. And the artist will try to create this visual interpretation of an idea or a concept. The more they have, the better. So they're just like, they're starving for that data, so the more of that, the better. So yeah, let me go ahead into the next kind of piece. I'll start off here, Laurel. So some of the things that illustrators and artists should keep in mind. I know this is from the artist side, but it's good for even writers to kind of understand things that the illustrators and the artists keep in mind. So diverse first. So this is important for us especially on Lifeology, especially when you're dealing with topics that for your audience, like literally sometimes we have these courses that are driven to a very specific demographic. So maybe we're studying a certain illness or a study in the African American community or something like that. So in those cases, those things are important to take into account. Not only who the artist is, their background, but also even the writer, or who's involved in the conversation, who's consulting on the information. All those things are important, and diversity is a big deal for us. We find it extremely important for us here at Lifeology. So it's due diligence for anyone writing anything that is going to involve science and health to include that in there too. Direction of action, people read from left to right. Yeah, so this is important, especially when we do a lot of translations as well in Lifeology. And if you are doing translation, that is definitely something to take into account. Even, I mean, I know it's a very specific thing, reading from left to right, but then, we can also, and we're not really delving into it too much here, but even cultural things, right? When you're doing courses that involve certain cultures, like you want to embrace that, you want to bring that into the artwork, you want to bring that into the character. So that's just as important. Laurel, you want to speak to the rest of them there?
Yeah, so and to add on to the direction of action thing, this is something as an illustrator that I always try to do, is that it comes from the comic book world, that when you are drawing a narrative, essentially, you want to make sure that you are keeping the action flowing in the direction that people move. So say when we're looking at a Lifeology course and you're on a mobile app, you're still going to scroll from left to right too. And so you always want the action of your illustration to be pointing the way you want people to move, or in which case they're going to scroll. If they point the opposite way, that has a negative connotation. And so you would use that if it's something you don't want people to do necessarily. If you're saying this is not something, you should do for your own health, or it's negative, that's when you have illustrations that point to the right instead. The rest of this is pretty specific for small mobile app stuff. So we talk about using a lot of negative space to make sure that you have something to direct the flow of action around, so that you draw the eye to the appropriate places in the illustrations. On a mobile app, illustrations are super teeny tiny. So you need to really be careful about where you're putting your elements and how you're arranging them so that you are using the space to the best of your ability. Lifeology in particular also uses a square canvas, and we've had some issues with images that are not square working appropriately with it. So we always work with a square to start with, and we add padding around the sides so that we're making sure we're not running into like the edges of somebody's phone with our illustrations. And the last part is, I think, especially as someone who has been a freelancer for a long time, so important is, as an artist, you should always be getting paid. And I'll let Doryan talk a little bit more about Lifeology's theory about this, but like, be mercenary, advocate for yourself. Don't do stuff for free.
Yeah, it's a can of worms. That's a whole other probably webinar. But the key here, not only for artists to keep in mind, but also writers to keep in mind. Yeah, we understand that usually, especially in the clinical research space, usually is not a lot of budgeting. And even if you're writing on your own, there's not a lot of budgeting. But, one thing that we make it clear is, anyone who has a craft or skill should be paid, specifically artists, since artists seem for some reason to, they're prone to have a lot of spec work, specific, like this is like work that, hey, draw something, we'll put it up in the contest, and if you win the job. But if you don't, you've basically done work for nothing, which does not move the needle for artists in general or the craft. So keeping in mind that, everyone is very respectful of what they do. We are very respectful of the writers. We are just as respectful of the artists. So it's really just putting it out there of, for artists, obviously, yes, make sure you get paid. I can't speak to like different things that you could do in lieu of it, but that's what we always stress. And especially on the Lifeology side, before we even took steps to go near the platform or even do this, our first thing that we made sure we did was, do we have can we set up some kind of system so that the artists get paid? And luckily we were able to figure something out, and it's been working for us. And we just wanted to put this out there. Again, it's a bigger conversation. You could Google to your heart's content this back and forth. And it's not like a crazy scenario like, oh, everyone should get paid, but it's more of kind of like artists have a tough time kind of getting work where it's looked upon as like, yes, we will go ahead and pay you. But if there is a budget struggle or there's something going on, interact. Communication is amazing. Contact the artist, have a discussion, say it. I've worked with plenty of people and clients where they didn't have a great budget, but I was really into the topic or the mission. So there are things that you can work out, but just make sure that this is something that is paid attention to.
Doryan and Laurel,
Yeah.
just to interject, I know we had a question from the audience just about like funding sources for even for like an artist that wants to go after funding for like a storytelling project. Do you know of any organizations that do like funding for education or like art or anything like that?
The first place I would look is something, specific to your location. A lot of cities, a lot of states do art grants. And especially if you're in a lower population area, there's not a ton of competition for them. And so the first place I look when I'm looking for grants is my local area. And I start looking for arts organizations, I start looking for science organizations, and kind of seeing who's in my kind of immediate radar scope that I can look at for that. If you're going after, national grants in any country, there's a lot more competition for that. And so you're less likely to receive those. And so really look at the smaller organizations, because they do have money and a lot of times people don't know about them. And so those grants go unrewarded sometimes.
Awesome. Thanks, Laurel.
Mhm.
Great. Yeah, so I thought I just go into a little bit about one of our use cases that we had. We still have a relationship with Eli Lilly. So Eli Lilly is a pharmaceutical company that we've been working with on using these Lifeology courses. And I just thought I'd just use it as context of how we kind of took all these ideas and brought it over. Essentially, and I'm not going to get too in the weeds or details, but essentially what happened is Eli Lilly is a big pharma company, and they had this content and information that they wanted to get out. Some of it was, as you could see in the slide, COVID-19 for kids, and then what is COVID-19 for African American community. We also did some clinical trial specific stuff that was for a specific demographic. So the great thing about that use case is we had a big pharma company who had a lot of kind of information, and we were able to basically tell them, well, we had this narrative idea, this platform, which they really liked the platform, how it was served up. But where I really think it took hold was the fact that we were able to say, well, look, we're going to work with you on writing these stories. And then the beautiful thing that came out of it was we were able to define these characters, which I think are really rich characters and really like hit home. And we essentially got with the team. I think there was like an educational team on the for Eli Lilly, and we met with them, work with their writers. We had these meetings where we would discuss the characters, what's the story arc. Obviously, with a company that large, there's a lot of things like you have to make sure all of the information is accurate, and you're not, you're covering a lot of things that you need to. But even with all that, at that kind of scale, it really worked nicely. And we're really proud of the work that came out of it, because we're able to tell these stories in a very human way and very specific to the culture and the demographic that we were trying to reach, bringing in all those elements that we were saying, like bringing in an artist from that community, bringing writers from that, bringing in consultants and people who could speak to the experiences from that demographic. It was just really a really amazing kind of bringing together of all those pieces. And what we see, if you're able, and I'll send this link out as well on the follow-up email. What we have on the Lilly site is you're able to see these, what they call modules, but there are courses. And you're able to see these concepts and ideas that are kind of serious, very complicated areas, but written in a way where you have a story and you're going to take a journey and you're going to see, oh, I identify myself through that character. And it's not talking over my head. We're also not talking down to anyone. It's just it was a very great experience. And so on a smaller scale, if you're able to bring some of the content, if you are a writer, and say, okay, well, I kind of know what my audience is. I think I know what the character would be, or I have a metaphor. Start there, bring that story together. When you then pair up with an artist or a creative, you'll be amazed what will come from those discussions. You'll be able to really, because those, even the discussions with Lily, where we were in those meetings and it was very collaborative. It was just us riffing on it. There was things that we had to do, but it was very collaborative. And that's really the key to storytelling in SciArt as well, is this collaboration. It's amazing. There's no two ways about it. You can't really do it this way without having some collaboration from both parties. It's not like you're bringing this done piece to an artist and say, like, just please do it exactly the way I tell you, because that also that's going to be a different product at the end of the day. What you want is that feedback, because the artist will have something to say, the writer will have something to say, and even the what we found a lot, which was very interesting, the journey there, we wouldn't have gotten there if we didn't go through that journey. So it's very interesting sometimes where you end up. So it's hopefully something that I mean, we're going to keep doing it because we know this is the way we could. And by the way, we've been getting the feedback off of the courses themselves. We do have metrics on the Lifeology side, and it's all positive. It's all like, you know, sometimes there's some critiques of the art style and stuff. Maybe it's a little bit too like whatever, but really we've not gotten any feedback other than this is a better way for me to digest this information. And at the end of the day, that's what we're looking for. We just need to get it out to a broader audience. So I just thought I'd bring that in. So we'll dive into some like tools. I know this is kind of like from the art side of it, and I know a couple of people brought up some things about from a researcher or from the writer, and so we'll definitely take some time to answer those questions. But I thought I'd let Laurel start with kind of what she uses and what tools we use. It's definitely of interest because you want to know what the artists you're going to be working for, you're going to be working with, what are they using, and what, because some of these yeah, it's just very interesting to know kind of like the tools that we're using at our disposal. So go ahead, Laurel.
So I'm a digital artist. So most of my work is done on my tablet monitor. So I have a massive monitor that's right over here that is my drawing tablet. And I primarily use Photoshop with a little bit of Illustrator when I need more kind of vector-based stuff in there. I tend to use a lot of brushes, and Doryan and I talked about kind of where we got our brushes earlier. I tend to get most of mine from Adobe. Adobe has a really good library of brushes if you're interested in kind of looking for brush sets or textures or things like that to kind of give your art a little more life. That is to say, it is totally okay if you are not a digital artist. If you want to, you know, do traditional pen and paper, pen and ink, you want to do watercolor, there's nothing wrong with that. You just kind of need a way, especially because, you know, you are likely going to be collaborating with people who are nowhere near you on Earth. You just need a way to make sure that you can scan those in at a high resolution and get them, you know, to where they look good in a digital format as well.
Yeah, I like to add too, that's a good point, Laurel, about, I mean, we're using these tools, like I'll get into Procreate and kind of what I use there, but we found even in the course, Lifeology courses, the way an artist represents their art is unique to them. It's as unique as a fingerprint. So it could be digital art, it could be photography, it could be like physical watercolor that they take a picture of. I mean, it really could be, the sky's the limit as far as like the interpretation of the art. So this is specific to us, but I just wanted to open that up because we've been even looking at Lifeology of using different art styles. Our go-to is obviously art, like drawing art, but there are other avenues that people have asked us about that we are definitely going to be looking into. I am the same. I'm a digital artist, and I've used Procreate, which is an iPad and an Apple Pencil, and that's been kind of since that's come out, it's been like a game changer for me. I used to do everything on Photoshop, and I used to do everything in like actual pencil and paper, scan it, bring it into Photoshop, and then kind of trace it, the whole workaround. And then Procreate came around for the iPad when the new iPad Pro came out, and you can use a pencil, and an Apple created pencil, which is one of the best tools out there. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I use. And again, you can, digital art in general has just, I've seen it leaps and bounds just in the past, even 5 years, but more like 10 years. Like it's been crazy how creative and amazing the artwork is coming out of the digital community. So, you know, really, this is where these tools pop up. The better these digital artists become, the better the tools get. It's kind of the same thing on product design, which I also do. But yeah, it's been really great. So yeah, so all right, this is great. We're gonna get into some questions here. I know we had some. Paige, are you still on here?
Yeah, I can bring up one I
keeping-
know came in early. It
Yeah,
was
please.
oh, one was like, as a, this comes from an illustrator, I believe, like, how do you balance needing to understand the subject enough to condense it
Yeah.
without becoming such an expert that you like get stuck in the weeds of explaining it?
So I know Laura has some some experience in this, because she works on projects here that do get into the weeds somewhat. But from the Lifeology end, and just in general, if you're going down the storytelling path, so that's another benefit of this. If you're able to pull a story arc into your your topic or what you're writing on, that brings it down a bunch, because then you don't really have to get into the weeds of like, all right, now I have to learn about molecular biology and all this kind of stuff. Oh, it's a character who, this is a metaphor, it's a visual metaphor of so and so. So that's going to be key. Now, if you happen to not have that storyline, I'll let Laurel get into like how she's been kind of navigating that. But I do know, as long as, and again, I'm going to stress this over and over again, the communication between the writer and the artist is key here. If there are things that sometimes will just have to be represented in a very technical and accurate way, so be it. So that's where kind of the writer will have to do their due diligence and say, okay, this we need this specifically. Now, whether there's any wiggle room on creativity or not, that really depends all on like what the narrative is, or what you're trying to do with the story, if you have a story. But I'll let Laurel tell us some of the, you've been going through this with kind of the recent projects that we've been working on.
Yeah, so what our process is that I work most closely with our content writer. And our content writer is not necessarily an expert on every subject matter that we cover, but they have enough knowledge that they can kind of go over what we get from our subject experts and make that into our narrative if the expert doesn't give us any guidance on that. And then after our writer goes through and they kind of do their draft, we have our subject matter expert actually come back and take a look at it and make sure that it's accurate for them. And that's the point where I start storyboarding. And my storyboards are then checked over by our content writer, and we kind of adjust from there. Like I said, there have been issues. I'm not a scientist or a doctor. I don't have all of this knowledge. I'm a comic book artist. And so there are obviously things that I'm going to get wrong from time to time. And, we have to change and fix. And that's totally okay. A lot of it really is just communication. And even if you're writing this and you don't feel like you're a subject matter expert, if you can find one to kind of just give it a look over, before you submit it to your artist, something like that, to just kind of make sure your ducks are in a row, that can be really helpful.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura.
Mm-hmm.
I saw
there's some other questions actually that kind of like us questions that kind of go together, I think.
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
basically, how early does the artist come in? Or should they come in? Can they be part of the brainstorming of like the story arc, And related to that, like who's doing the kind of the metaphor, right? Like whose job is it to create those metaphors? And yeah.
I, I mean,
Um,
yeah, go ahead,
sorry.
Laura. No, you go
I,
ahead.
I think it really depends. Sometimes when I go in to look at a course that's been written, there isn't a metaphor, and I'm the one who's like, okay, I'm just going to suggest these when I start doing my sketches, and this is my idea that I've come up with on the spot. And sometimes I go in and there's something that's already there, and it happens both ways fairly frequently. And I think you just kind of have to adjust. In some cases, there might be something that I think I could come up with a better plan for. And that's the point where we communicate and I say, well, you have this written here, but I have this idea for it instead. Do you think we could change it? And that's totally fine.
Yeah, and I would say my go-to gut, and this is not even just in art, just in design in general, if possible, as early and often as you can, bring in the artist. Because even like I said, the discussions before even a pencil hits the paper or concepts are there. If you're the writer and you're trying to flesh things out, I mean, you can't get any more creative than an artist. So they're gonna be able to help with the brainstorming. So if at all possible, I would bring them in early. That's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah, I often take a look at courses before they're finished editing, in the kind of beginning stages. And that's, a good place to make suggestions if you can get an artist in that early. But if you can't, just kind of try to be open to if they have suggestions after the fact.
Right. So I did see there was one question around that we're going one way with it. Hold on one second. Let me see. Someone asked that we talked about science writers finding artists. What about the reverse? How can artists find interested content creators? I know, Paige, I know you think you had a good answer about getting plugged into the SciComm and health literacy communities, right?
Yeah, I posted some feedback in there, but
Yeah. So that's even, I mean, here's the thing. So even it's funny because even for Lifeology, when we did this, that was one of the things we noticed is it's very hard. Like we were trying to, part of our product is building a directory. We want to build a directory of these researchers and writers and artists that are all going to be able to be searched and found, because it is hard to find that. SciComm and health literacy communities, like there is going to be some kind of having to look around for that. But and again, I don't know, and maybe Paige, how are there a lot of, it seems like science communication is kind of coming into its own now. So I think more and more communities are popping up. So I think if a good search would find those communities, correct?
yeah, I think, the hard part for artists these days is that a lot of science communication scientists are now increasingly looking for these like creative collaborations for artists, but they don't know where to go either. So they're just jumping on their Twitter or posting it on a forum, or maybe, doing a job posting somewhere. Like they're trying to figure out where to post it. So they're not very organized about how they do that either. So I think these days it kind of looks like some legwork to kind of monitor those communities and hashtags. At Lifeology, we're trying to create a community where scientists can come to post job adverts for artists, but I think sometimes it involves just like talking to scientists or scientific organizations that if you like, they do this kind of thing, just bringing up the idea of like collaborating to help them create more visual content.
Yeah, I'll add too. So we have a free Slack channel where we have our community like talks back and forth. Even something as simple as that, just getting out there, getting in there, talking with, like, putting your information out there or getting in those discussions. But again, like we would love to be one day where they know just to go to us, but like you still have to kind of find us if you weren't in this community. So yeah, there is going to be some still for artists. You're going to have to go out there and kind of search, but at least knowing those keywords like SciComm, right? And like health literacy. Those are keywords you'll want to kind of key in on. And if there's discussion groups around that, you can get in there. I'm sure even like Reddit, Laurel turned me on to Reddit a little while back, and that's got every topic under the sun. So I would be very surprised if there wasn't like a whole thread, like kind of forum just on that, and where you could get more locked into a community to start speaking with researchers and writers.
Yeah. And I would also say, as an artist, if you decide that you really want to go after work in the SciComm community, it's like approaching any other kind of job that you want to tailor your portfolio to that. You want to start posting in those communities saying, here's my work, I'm interested, because these people can't necessarily find you on their own either. And so it's like any other thing. If you want to do comic books, you tailor your portfolio so that you have a bunch of comic books there, because that's what you are trying to get a job with. And so if you want to do SciComm, it's the same thing. Like, look at the kind of art that's in SciComm, try and find a niche for yourself, and then start interacting with that community, make yourself known.
Great. Was there anything else I missed, Paige? I didn't see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, I think that was most of the questions that I saw. I think we've captured them, unless anyone else has.
Okay. So we did go through them. All right, cool. Yeah, so I mean, I think the big kind of takeaway here, and I think we hit this home a lot, is from the writer standpoint. What we found, I mean, to be honest, we built this whole product, Lifeology, around the idea of storytelling with science. So, I mean, it's a viable thing. It works. It's something that is really needed. And if you want more, more retention, or the ability to get your information out there, if you're a researcher and you want to get your research is published, but you want to get it to a broader audience, the way to go is through storytelling, and then pairing that up with an artist. And there are many communities, and I think what we found is there's a lot of places to go, but it's kind of hard, like nailing it down. So there's going to be some legwork, but in the end, if you do that extra work, then it'll get to the right people. And what we're trying to do here, all Lifeology is kind of the bigger goal is getting this information out to everyone. Everyone should have access to this information. Everyone should be able to understand it. But that's not always the case. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And the same thing for writers and researchers. You're writing this amazing, paper or article on an amazing thing that was discovered or you learned. The next step is making sure everyone can understand it, and then just wrap it around the metaphor of storytelling and art, and that should be. We found it does amazing things, and people are really latching onto it. So we're hoping that this was helpful. Laura, did you any parting thoughts before we wrap it up?
I think the last thing I would want to say is we talked a lot about collaboration today, and that really is like the best way to do this. Like, storytelling with SciComm and art is exactly what those two things bring together. And that if you find somebody who can collaborate with you and you can work with them, the sum is always greater than the parts, and putting art and science or medicine together has amazing results, and it just takes that collaboration and coming together to do it.
Yeah, amazing. Paige, anything?
That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for taking this time out of your day. Hope you got something out of it, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Lifeology if you have any further questions.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you all. Appreciate it. Bye.